What is the local housing allowance, the LHA? Really good question, and it's really important to get your head around this if you're looking at your housing options, because crucially it's going to basically define how much money you'll get from the DWP through universal credit for private rented accommodation. And it's important just to say that it is only relating to private rented accommodation. It doesn't define social housing or supported accommodation or anything like that. So it's just basically those private rents, those assured short hold tenancies in your area that's probably going to be applying to. But as with anything from the DWP, there's lots of criteria, and then there's lots of exemptions to that criteria, and you're not necessarily going to get told about these exemptions, and you could actually end up losing out. So there's a lot of exemptions which are actually very helpful for you if you're in this situation. It's probably quite helpful to explain what the LHA is and how it's calculated. Back in the day, I think it used to be calculated so that it was supposed to cover 50% of the properties available in the private rented market in the area, in the district. But back in 2012, when you had lots of austerity stuff come in, that percentage was cut, I think, to 30%. But the reality is now is that, you know, the LHA is unlikely to cover most private rented accommodation in your area, and for that reason you're likely to have you're going to have a shortfall, and you're probably going to have to make that rent up through other income, which is far from ideal, and actually causes councils problems, because technically you may well be homeless because you can't afford your rent, because you're having to pay this top up out of your living costs, your essential living costs from universal credit. I've done other videos about that to explain more. But basically, if you go to your local council's website, so if you search for your local council's website and then put in local housing allowance, you will get a table. And I'm using Central Beds here as an example, just to kind of run you through. So this is Central Beds document here. Now you'll notice here that first of all there's two tables, and Central Beds is an interesting one, which is why I've used it, because within Central Beds you've got 4 different rates within the district. So Central Beds is quite a large area, and essentially what they do is they use the neighbouring areas to define the LHA. So, you know, if you're the Luton end of Central Beds, you'll get X amount. If you're at the Bedford end, you'll get Y amount, and so on. So you've got 2 tables here. One is for the weekly rates and one is for the monthly rates, and it's probably just important to point out that months are not 4 weeks, they're not 28 days, they're more than that. They're something like 30.5 days or whatever it is, the average. So when you're looking at these monthly rental amounts, which is probably what you're going to be dealing with, it's just something to bear in mind, that actually the weekly rate doesn't necessarily, it's not just about basically multiplying it by 4. You've got to do a bit more complicated maths with it, but in most cases you're going to have the calendar monthly amounts as well. And so we see here that we've got 5 different columns with numbers in them, and they range from shared facilities, so that's shared accommodation, through to 1 bed, 2 bed, 3 bed, and then 4 or more bedrooms. So the first thing to understand is that you are going to be capped by the amount of bedrooms you need, and that's quite a complicated calculation again. On your council's website it will set out the criteria, but it's basically about how many household members you've got and essentially what the makeup of those household members is. So for example, children under 10 are expected to share if there's up to 2 of them, but then older children of different sexes are expected to have their own room. So it gets a little bit complicated, but again you can kind of use the website to find that stuff out, so I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. Couples are obviously restricted to having 1 room. So that's the kind of way it kind of works, and it's really important. This is probably the first important thing to say about this in terms of things that won't be obvious, but the amount you get is calculated by how many bedrooms you need, not by how many bedrooms you actually have. And this can be handy. It's far from ideal, but if you are absolutely desperate, and let's say you need a 4-bed home, and there's no way on earth you're going to be able to afford the 4-bed properties in your area, then if you were able to find a 3-bed property which would be suitable for you, or as suitable as possible for you, maybe there might be a box room that doesn't count as a bedroom that you could use as a bedroom, or it might be there's an additional reception room or something like that that you could convert to a bedroom, something like that, then you'd still get the 4-bed rate, even though it's only a 3-bed property, because you need the 4-bed rate. So let's assume you've got the number of children that would entitle you to the 4-bed rate. That's how that would be calculated. So as I say, that's not necessarily obvious. You might kind of, you get the response from a professional to say, well, it's only a 3-bed property, so you're only going to get the 3-bed rate. But as I say, you need to kind of dig a little bit deeper and look into that, and actually potentially challenge that and raise this issue with them if they're kind of not raising it with them, if they're not pointing this out themselves. So as I say, that's kind of the overarching stuff. And when we talk about shared facilities, shared accommodation here, we're talking about basically a converted home. Often it's called a house of multiple occupation, or HMO. And that's where you basically have your own bedroom, so you've got your own door key for your bedroom, but you share the kitchen, bathroom, lounge facilities if there are any, with the other people living there, and you probably won't know the other people living there. So this is kind of one of the issues that this HMO system causes. And also there is a tendency for the landlords to basically be very kind of profit focused, let's say. So they're not, in my experience, they don't tend to be particularly focused on the quality of the accommodation or the enjoyment of the people in the property of that home. It's very much getting as much money out of the property as they can. Some people will only qualify for the shared accommodation rate, and now ordinarily that would be single people under the age of 35. So generally speaking, if you're single, you're under 35, you will only get the shared accommodation rate from the DWP. But there are some important exemptions to this, and I'm just going to bring up my little list here so I don't forget any. But for example, if you're a survivor of domestic abuse, if you're a survivor of modern slavery or human trafficking and so on, then you would potentially qualify for an exemption, which means you would be able to get the one bed rate no matter how old you are. And when it comes to proving this to the DWP, you'd use a similar kind of level of evidence as you would within a homeless application, I would say, which is basically that the DWP's default position should be to believe victims of domestic abuse. So if you're saying you've been abused, that should be enough. But often there's going to be supporting evidence from various professionals, whether it be the police or an IDVA through the MARAC, or maybe a kind of even a school teacher or a social service, kind of children's services type worker. They may have some information which would support that. You just need to provide that, and that should be basically enough to show that you're eligible for the one bed rate. With modern slavery, there's something called a positive grounds notice or positive grounds decision, and that's you would need that from the Home Office in order to actually qualify for this. So it's a bit of a higher level of evidence you'd need for that. But again, if you're known to the NRM or something like that, you probably have that documentation already. You just need to provide it to get the exemption. Now, there's another exemption here which I don't know if it's changed since it first came in. When it first came in 2012, 2013 or whatever, basically for people aged between 25 and 35, if they'd lived in supported accommodation for a total of 3 months at any point during their life, they qualify for the over 35 rate, the one bed rate. As I say, the dates that you'd stayed in supported accommodation could be lots of little stays. So I remember working with a guy when this first came in. He was 26, I think, and he basically he's been dotting around the country in different night shelters. And so literally I got him to tell me which night shelters he'd been in, and I then approached all those night shelters and got them to basically give evidence of the dates he'd stayed there. And I just kept going until it added up to a total of 91 days or whatever 3 months would be. Provided it to what was then the Housing Benefit Department, and they were able to kind of apply this exemption to him. So there's going to be quite a few people who would be in that age bracket who would kind of be able to qualify for that. Now, the thing that might have changed is it used to be specific for people aged between 25 and 35, but when I looked on the government website recently, there was no mention of the 35 lower, the 25 lower age limit. So I think potentially that would apply to anyone, anyone who's essentially 16 or over. You'd be able to get that exemption and get the one bed rate rather than the shared room rate. You've also got people who are in receipt of the daily living component of PIP, and that should be pretty easy to demonstrate because you're getting it from DWP, so they should be able to figure that out themselves. And then you've also got another odd one, in my opinion, where it's, again, this is where it does use this age limit of 25 to 35, or 25 to 34 or whatever, for people who have at some point been subject to MAPA conditions. Now, this MAPA conditions are basically multi-agency public protection arrangements, and they are in place for people who are identified as high-risk offenders. So the reasoning here is that you don't want to be putting a high-risk offender into a shared accommodation environment, which totally makes sense. What I don't understand is why there's a lower age limit on that, because it's entirely possible to be 24 and be dangerous. And it seems to me, going on what the government website has at the moment, was that if you're 24, having been subject to MAPA, you would still only get the shared accommodation rate rather than the one bed rate. So again, I don't understand how that doesn't put people at risk of harm, but that's what it says. Now, a few other things you need to know. So couples without children, they're going to get the one bed rate no matter how old they are. And as I've explained in a different video, the reason that couples approaching local authorities making homeless applications will often get the private rented accommodation as a result of that is because that if you've got two incomes, if you've got two of you able to essentially split the bills, it's more likely you're going to be able to afford private rented accommodation rather than social housing, because generally social housing is way cheaper, like hundreds of pounds a month cheaper than private rented. So as I say, that's kind of something that you kind of want to bear in mind. If you're a couple making a homeless application and you're owed the main homelessness duty, it's still only likely you're going to get private rented accommodation. It's very unlikely, in my experience, you'll get social housing. You just won't get that far into the process. Another couple of things that's probably worth bearing in mind. So a mother and child, a newborn child would be eligible for the kind of appropriate number of rooms, but until the mother gives birth, she's still treated as a single person without children. So she's still potentially, if she's under 35, she's still going to be only eligible for the shared accommodation rate. Now I worked with a lady in that situation. I can't remember how old she was. I think she was like 27 or something. She was about to give birth. There was already some antisocial behaviour in the block she was living in, which was having a pretty marked impact on her mental health. And we made a homeless application, and essentially the council initially said that they were only going to house her, or they're only going to consider her for shared accommodation rate, before she gives birth, and then they're expecting her to then make another homeless application once she's given birth to get moved into a one-bed property. Ultimately, the way I dealt with that is I went to the children's services portfolio holder, so the counsellor who was in charge of children's services, and said to him, look, this is a lady who's already got some pretty significant mental health issues. This is obviously going to be a very difficult time for her. Can the council not just basically help her into a one-bed property now, rather than expecting her to go through the process again in a few months' time? And that was enough in that sense, in that situation, to get the council to change tact. So I think that's all the exemptions I want to go through. If you've got any questions about any of this, or you think I've got anything wrong, because I do get stuff wrong sometimes for certain, this is kind of based on my day-to-day work rather than knowing the ins and outs of the law. So do kind of point anything out. And as always, we're doing live streams fairly regularly now, so do check us out on the live streams just to ask questions about this kind of stuff, and do keep your questions coming in the YouTube comments, and also all that sort of YouTube stuff. Please subscribe, like the video, blah blah blah, share it with people you know might be interested. It's probably a better thing to do, actually.